Barry Bryson here. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. We're finishing up our study of Second Timothy and the martyrdom of Paul today. Next time we're together, we're going to introduce the martyrdom of Peter and the book of Second Peter, and we're going to read that. Paul and Peter, these two pillars of the first century church. I don't know that anyone in the first century following the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus were more influential, were more important than Peter and Paul. And the two of them together, they died close in time together. Paul dies first. We'll talk about why we think that today. Peter dies second. And we don't know how much separated their death. And we don't have a whole lot of information about their death. What little we have, we'll share today. And I won't take up so much of your time because I don't have a whole lot of information today. So, AD 64, Rome burns. So that's probably caused by agents of Nero. Nero blames the Christians. This begins the first empire-sponsored persecution of Christians. Paul and Peter are evidently both in Rome when this occurs, or Peter comes shortly afterward. Paul is there in jail. We know about Paul's incarceration. It started out when he was arrested in Jerusalem. The Romans saved him as a Roman citizen from mob violence. He appealed to Caesar, ends up in Rome under house arrest, and eventually ends up in the Mamertine prison, actual jail in Rome. And we've talked about that already. Another date that we need to think about, especially as we think about the sequence of events in terms of the Paul and Timothy and what happened to them, is the destruction of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. Um, but the siege of Jerusalem is going on as these words are being written. The Jews rebelled. The Zealots basically took control of Judaism. The Jews rebelled. They were able to expel the Romans from the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was besieged. It took a while to break the revolution. Jerusalem is destroyed, and then the last stronghold of the resistance, Masada, is destroyed. There will be another revolution in the second century, in the 130s, the Bar Kokhba rebellion in Palestine. But with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the Lord, with the iron fist of the Roman Empire, once and for all destroys Old Testament Judaism. The Hebrew writer is writing on the eve of this event, and he gives us a little bit of a detail in chapter 13. So let's talk about what we know from Scripture. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy, come fast, come as quickly as you can, pick up my coat, pick up my books, pick up my writing material, and bring John Mark. Bring Mark with you. I need Mark here. I want him with you. I want the two of you boys here. Um, and evidently that happened because we know from 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 13 that right there at Peter's side, as Peter is near the end of his life and in Rome, clearly in Rome, he says, I'm writing you from Babylon. That's Rome. He's not in Mesopotamia. He's Rome. That's what Jews, that's code. And when he says Babylon, he means Rome. He says, Mark is here with me. Now, he doesn't mention Paul. He mentions Paul in 2 Peter and he talks about how hard his writings are. Or no, uh, um, but but um, but he does mention Mark there. Now, if Mark came to Rome to be with Paul, but he's not with Paul, he's with Peter, we assume that Paul's already dead because it doesn't matter that Paul's in prison. He would be Paul's staff, not Peter's staff. But Peter has, and we'll read this later, Peter has inherited some men who have been working with Paul. We know something else from the book of Hebrews, Hebrews chapter 13. The writer of Hebrews tells us in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 23, take notice that our brother Timothy has been released, whom, if he comes soon, uh, uh, with whom, if he comes soon, I shall see you. So Timothy evidently went to jail and then is released from prison. Why he's released and not executed the way Paul and Peter are, I don't know. But that's what we know about from the word about the goings on. So Timothy evidently picks up Mark the way he says, makes it to Rome. Does he make it to Rome before Paul dies? We don't know. But he makes it to Rome before Peter dies because Mark starts working with Peter and Timothy himself gets arrested and then is released. What we know about Paul's death, what everyone who heard anything about Paul's death tells us, is that he was beheaded. And that makes sense. He would not have been crucified. He was a Roman citizen. He would have been beheaded, and that he was beheaded. That's how he was executed. Executed in the 60s, in the wake of the burning of Rome, before Peter was executed. That's what we know from the best sources that we have. What happened to Timothy? Well, there's an apocryphal book from the early centuries, second, third century, called the Acts of Timothy, which may contain some truth in it based upon, oral history about what happened with Timothy. What we know from the best sources that we have, which aren't necessarily great, what we are told is that after he's released from prison, Timothy goes back to Ephesus and serves as the preacher in Ephesus, doing exactly what Paul told him to do. Stay in Ephesus, preach the word, until he himself is martyred in his 80s. And what we are told is that in 97 AD, and Paul himself is somewhere in Timothy, is somewhere in his 80s. In 97 AD, a mob devoted to the worship of Artemis, whose temple, one of the seven wonders of the world, is right there in Ephesus, that a mob finds him and murders him in the street, either by beating him to death, stoning him, but murders him in the street. That's the best information that we have. And it fits with what we know otherwise. So whether that actually happened, that's as close as we can get to what we know about Timothy's own death. If that's what happened, that kind of makes my heart happy too. That Timothy did exactly what Paul told him to do: stay in Ephesus and preach the word, and that he was able to pour his life out as a libation, the way Paul did, and and complement the sacrifice of Jesus the way Paul did, and to receive the Stephanos, the victor's crown. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. Next time, we'll talk about Peter's martyrdom in 2 Peter. Thank you for joining me.